From the southern states seceding from the Union, the Civil War starting, and bloody disorderly chaos breaking loose, Confederate General John Hunt Morgan was a small part of the Civil War. He led a raid through Kentucky, Indiana, and Ohio, with victories and losses, strategic thinking, and a lot of bold moves. A Confederate raid was led to distract and weaken Union troops. The raiders triumphantly diverted 100,000 Union troops out of Ohio, captured supplies, won Corydon and DuPont, leaving states in terrible debt. Tragically, Morgan was killed in Greenville, his brother died in battle, and 800 men were arrested, while Ohio and Indiana quickly bounced back from the diversion. Brigadier General John Hunt Morgan and his men are the story to be told.
My opinion on Morgan is based off of what I've read, but I think he was a very rebellious person. He got kicked out of college for being rebellious, and then even in the Civil War, he always went against orders. He kind of wanted to, he was very arrogant, kind of wanted to always, prove himself to be more than what he was.
In the summer of 1863, a Confederate army under the order of General Braxton Bragg had been weakened by being sent to aid in the Battle of Vicksburg. He had to retreat troops in battle, but to cover it up, he sent General Morgan and his men to ride into Kentucky and raid Louisville and Union troops there. But Morgan had his own plan, to continue the raid in southern Indiana, Ohio. General Bragg quickly opposed the idea and told Morgan to stay in Kentucky. Morgan already set his plan in motion, leading his men 20 hours a day on horseback to reach the Ohio River. Leaving Kentucky, Morgan and his men made their way to Indiana. Morgan stole two steamboats, the Alice Dean and the J.T. McCombs, on the Kentucky banks ferrying 2,400 troops into southern Indiana. Before they docked, a force from Harrison County Home Guard fired upon the Confederates, but after a few Confederate shots back, the troops quickly scattered and retreated. The governor of Indiana at the time was terrified of Morgan and what he would do, so he sent out a statement asking for any able-bodied volunteers to defend Indiana from Morgan and his men.
The biggest reason is because the war finally came to their home front. Some of the men had joined up months prior or had joined up when they heard Morgan was coming. And so finally what they had read about in the papers were happening in their backyard, and they wanted him gone. They wanted him out of the state, and he had done so much destruction to the towns. They just kept pursuing him to win, or for them to win, and to get him out of the state as quickly as possible. All right.
Men. As news of Morgan and his men got to Corydon, local militias and Indiana Legion had quickly set up fortifications to prepare for the enemy to arrive. Around noon on July 9th, the first sign of Morgan's raiders appeared. Morgan and his men began to trickle in from a few soldiers holding their own to an overwhelming number, scaring the Union defenders to retreat and triumphantly for the South wave the white flag. Morgan had won Corydon.
I think they would have benefited. Well, I think Morgan came to Indiana because Indiana is known as the most southern state, because most folks that live in Indiana came from Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, so they have that southern route. So he thought he'd come to Indiana and get all of this support. All of these copperheads or southern sympathizers would join up with him and go fight the cause. So he thought he'd get all this support in Indiana, he could take over Indiana. But then that totally backfired, and they got here and they didn't want anything to do with him and fought back. So had it worked, he could have gained more support for the Confederacy in Indiana and gathered supplies, but it didn't work the way he wanted it to.
Morgan and his men raided Salem, DuPont, Versailles, and other small towns. There, he burned down buildings, stole weapons and horses from the Confederate Army, leaving Indiana in a grave state. The raiders left behind a trail of destruction before crossing into Ohio on July 13th. The Confederates entered Ohio at Harrison, 20 miles northwest of Cincinnati. 10,000 Ohio militiamen gathered to defend Cincinnati, but Morgan evaded the troops that night. Morgan led his cavalrymen through the outskirts of Cincinnati during the night of July 13th to 14th. They fought a skirmish near Union Army's Camp Dennison. After that, Morgan's raid tragically took a turn for the worse leading up to the Battle of Bluffington Island. Morgan's Confederates encountered a small earthwork defended by Ohio militia guarding Bluffington Island. Severely outnumbered, the militiamen retreated under the cover of the night. However, their presence together plus a flood of the Ohio River delayed Morgan enough to allow Union cavalry to catch up to the Confederates. Morgan's men attempted to force the Ohio River at the head of Bluffington Island. The Confederates succeeded in getting a small number of men across the river, but unlucky for them, 2 Union gunboats under Commander Finch and 1,000 soldiers under General Douglas appeared unexpectedly through the thick fog at 5:30 a.m. With a combined number of 3,000 Union troops to Morgan's 1,800 Confederate soldiers, things did not go so well. Morgan and his men were being attacked and outnumbered, causing them to retreat a half a mile up the Ohio River. When Morgan and his men docked, 2 brigades from General Hobson's division attacked Morgan from the west, while Judah's troops fought the Confederates from the south. In addition, from the river, Finch's 2 Union gunboats, the USS Mooch and the Algenian Belle, fired their cannons into the Confederates. These attacks posed deadly for the raiders, securing Morgan's tragic defeat. Morgan's report estimated 57 killed, 63 wounded, and 71 captured on the battlefield. Another blow to the Confederate force was the Union Army capturing Morgan's brother-in-law, Colonel Basil Duke, in the 24 hours following the battle. Union soldiers captured an additional 570 men in eastern Meigs County, northeast Gallup County, and along the West Virginia shore of the Ohio River. He traveled up the Ohio River to try and find a place to cross. When he did, many of his men succeeded in crossing before Finch's Union gunboats arrived. Morgan and his remaining 800 soldiers retreated westward and southward through Meigs and Gallia counties, and then moved in northeasterly direction through Vinton, Hocking, Athens, Perry, Morgan, Muskingum, Noble, Guernsey, Harrison, Jefferson, Carroll, and Columbia counties. Along the way, Morgan fought Union soldiers in Ohio militia at Cheshire, Eagleport, Washington, and Wintersville. Though Morgan escaped from these fights, Morgan kept picking up his pace trying to get out of enemy territory, and kept losing his men along who couldn't keep up. After Morgan kept evading the Union, eventually 3 miles west of West Point in Columbia County, Major G.W. Ruse Union cavalry surrounded Morgan's raiders and succeeded in capturing Morgan and 364 of his men. The Union soldiers took Morgan and most of his men to Cincinnati. After that, Morgan and his men went around to a lot of prisoner of war camps ranging from Chicago to Indianapolis. When Morgan and his men arrived at the Ohio Peninsula, where Morgan and his men quickly planned an escape. In November, Morgan and his men dug a tunnel through the cell to the prison yard. On November 27th, Morgan put his plan into action triumphantly. Morgan and 6 of his men broke out of the prison dressed as civilians and using grappling inventions to climb the walls, and buying a train ticket to Cincinnati from the money he smuggled into the prison, quickly making his way back to Kentucky to get back into the war. Upon his arrival back to Kentucky, he was put in charge of another raid on Knoxville, Tennessee. Alerted to his presence, Union Army was forced to act. The Union arrived and Morgan and his men tried to flee, but ended up badly for General Morgan. Brigadier General John Hunt Morgan was shot and killed in Greenville, Tennessee, trying to join his men fleeing the Union Army. Although General Morgan did not finish the raid in his lifetime, many positive and negative outcomes did occur. Morgan's raid left both Indiana and Ohio in grave debt from the attempts of Morgan's capture, burned buildings, and stolen property. Morgan and his men also successfully diverted 100,000 Union troops and captured supplies for the South, while the Confederates succeeded in also instilling fear in the civilian population. But Morgan did cause some hurt for the South. He failed to capture both states, and even if they diverted 100,000 Union troops, those soldiers quickly recovered and ended up securing a victory for the Union Army. So in the end, you could say Morgan's raid was full of triumph and tragedy.
Buckeyes mounted to join in the chase as Johnny galloped their way. Oh, gather your flocks and sound the alarm, for the partisan rangers have come. Bold knights of the road, they scour each farm and scamper at tap of the drum. How are you, telegraph? The snow